I think I have to, for once, agree with the people who are behind Russiagate and all of these calls for impeachment. I don't agree with what they're talking about in terms of impeachment, but they're calling for the release of the full unredacted Mueller report. And I could not agree more. If I was going to suggest something to William Barr, I would say screw it. Just release everything. Who cares? You know, but the reasoning behind not releasing the entire report without any redactions, I believe, is more connected to sources and methods, as the intelligence community prefers to call it, because of course they wouldn't want to compromise people who they have had cooperating with them in the past. Now, so in some cases, you would say these include people possibly like Oleg Deripaska and other Russian nationals who, they supplied information in order to, I guess, cover their own ass. And and prior to that, they were acting in their belief in order to help the FBI with an investigation and maybe protect themselves. But in reality, I don't really think most of those people had any good intentions when they were involved in this. In many cases, they were out to make a buck. So it says, this is from NBC, and by the way, there are other people reporting on this too, including Tim Pool made a pretty good video about this. So they said a coalition of the nation's biggest progressive grassroots organizations is activating a nationwide protest plan in response to Attorney General William Barr's expected failure to meet a Tuesday deadline set by House Democrats to release special counsel Robert Mueller's full Russia report to Congress. With hundreds of locations set across the country, Stand Up America, MoveOn.org, Indivisible, and Public Citizen are among the groups orchestrating a nationwide day of action on Thursday, according to a release provided to NBC News. The plan marks a shift in strategy for the coalition, which had for months been planning a protest in anticipation that the Mueller report might not be released to the public at all. After initially summarizing Mueller's work in a 4-page document sent to Congress on March 24th, Barr has said he'll release a more substantive version of the report by mid-April. But the Attorney General has indicated he will make several redactions, including classified information Congress has said it needs to see. Barr also would not commit to obtaining court approval to give to Congress grand jury-related materials, according to House Judiciary Committee Chair Gerald Nadler. Now the coalition's focus is to force transparency around one of the most politically sensitive documents in American history. Barr is not committed to releasing the full report and underlying evidence, the coalition said in its statement. Further, the group said Barr has given himself the leeway to redact huge portions of the findings from Congress and the American people. It's unclear how many people will actually turn out at the protests, but thousands have RSVP'd online to attend to TrumpisNotAboveTheLaw.org, including more than 16,000 who signed up to protest outside the White House. The protest plan has been activated once before, in November after Trump fired former Attorney General Jeff Sessions. So they hated Jeff Sessions when he was appointed because they said he was a racist and a bigot, and also, I guess a religious zealot. And when he got fired, they still protested because, and there was actually a funny meme of a woman carrying a sign and wearing this like really chagrined look on her face, and she's like, I can't believe I have to protest against the firing of Jeff Sessions. The day after the firing, protests were held in New York, Washington, and Cincinnati, among other places, with protesters demanding that Matthew Whitaker, who took over as acting Attorney General, recuse himself from the Mueller probe. This is the problem with people who talk about recusal. The reason that Jeff Sessions recused himself, which was not even that good of a reason, was that it was insinuated that he was involved in the Russiagate conspiracy because he met with the Russian ambassador. But the fact is that as a U.S. senator, you typically meet with the ambassadors of foreign countries. That's the way it is. he probably met with the ambassador from China a few times, and that's absolutely fine too. Or the ambassador from countries like, you know, Turkey. I mean, there's a lot of countries that we don't necessarily have great relationships with, but they still have ambassadors in this country. It's important to keep lines of communication open with other countries and have at least a channel for dialogue. You can't have this utter shutdown of any two-way speech, or just channeling it through either the top level executive branch, or the intelligence agencies, or things like that. Obviously, if we were in time of war, it would be a different sort of arrangement. But we're not at war with Russia as much as these people would like us to be, or they would like to believe that we are. We're not at war with Russia. Unfortunately, they've brought the relationship with Russia down to the level of a Cold War again, which is not a good thing for the world. It's not a good thing for all the countries affected. And it's very unfortunate. This week's protests are also intended to raise public awareness about more critical information in the full 400-page report at a time when many Americans appear confused about its contents. Nadler has scheduled votes on Wednesday for several subpoenas, including the entire Mueller report and underlying documents, as well as 5 Trump advisors who may have critical information. Barr's summary stated that the special counsel investigation did not find evidence the Trump campaign had conspired or coordinated with the Russian government. Separately, he ruled Trump had not engaged in obstruction of justice in the investigation. Notably, however, Barr said that while Mueller's report did not draw a conclusion about whether Trump had obstructed justice, it also does not exonerate him. So, the issue with obstruction of justice would be this. If there was material that was relevant to the investigation that a judge had agreed with the prosecution to subpoena, and Trump had refused, or Trump's legal team had refused to provide it, that would probably be obstruction of justice. If it's something that's been ruled that the prosecutor, Robert Mueller, would need in order to complete his investigation and the decision whether to indict, it's a grand jury investigation. So if they would have been denied those materials, you would have grounds at least for obstruction of justice, even if there was no underlying crime, because it could be that the materials that are being concealed could contain other crimes. Okay, that is some way that you could get obstruction of justice in the law. Okay, this is something that, like, some of these concepts are, people people behave as if they're blanket ideas that could cover literally anything you need, and then they behave as if the law is so opaque and nuanced that a regular person can't understand it. No, obstruction of justice, sure, there could be some complicated situations that would lead to an obstruction of justice charge, but at the end of the day, you still have to be able to convince a jury in a court of law to indict somebody, or to convict somebody of it. So you can indict somebody for obstruction of justice, but if in a courtroom you can't really convince a jury, and in some cases at the federal level a judge, then what is the point? You don't start a criminal proceeding just in order to have somebody indicted for obstruction of justice, even if there was no underlying crime. That's the basis. That's the basis of what many are saying is the reason that this was a witch hunt. I'm not talking about conservatives. I'm talking, for example, about the constitutional law professor Jonathan Turley, he's a dyed-in-the-wool liberal. I think he teaches at George Washington University. So there are plenty of people out there who have they have a career-long record of advocating for civil liberties, and they see this as a complete and utter farce that you're trying to stitch somebody up for obstruction of justice, even though the reason for the investigation has never been proven. The reason for the investigation was that people believed that Donald Trump was being manipulated and also complicit in a plot by the Kremlin to steal the election and sow discord. Barr's summary stated that the special counsel investigation did not find evidence that Trump campaign had. So, yeah, I think we read this paragraph already. Democrats have other questions, including whether the report contains additional examples of Russian attempts to reach out to the 2016 Trump campaign that were not reported to the FBI, about the Trump organization's financial ties to Russia, including a Trump Tower Moscow that Trump lied about during the campaign, and whether Trump sought to reward Russia for its interference in the 2016 election by seeking to lift sanctions early in his presidency. So, here's the thing about all of those. Any attempts to reach out to the 2016 Trump campaign by Russia, if they did not yield any fruit, okay, for example, the one that's most brought up is the meeting between Donald Trump Jr. and Natalia Veselnitskaya and a bunch of other Russian nationals at Trump Tower. First of all, those people were not actually directly affiliated with the Russian government. One of the people was a former lawyer in a prosecutor's office in Russia. But if nothing was exchanged, then what's the underlying crime? There isn't any. And really, their complaint is that he didn't report it to the FBI. Well, why would you report to the FBI somebody coming to you and telling you something that's virtually worthless? You probably wouldn't. It's really that shows the desperation of it. Trump organization's financial ties to Russia. Doing business with Russia is not something that is exactly a crime in the United States. I mean, if let's say you have to buy, if you're an alcohol distributor, sorry to be the stereotypical, but if you're buying, shipments and of Stolichная vodka, for example, or you're buying caviar, or you're buying other products made in Russia that are legally importable in the U.S., then I'm sorry, that doesn't make you some sort of criminal and villain in one of these John le Carre novels that they're talking about. It's ridiculous. You are allowed to do business with Russia. In fact, during the Cold War, people were allowed to do business in Russia or with the Russian government in some cases, Soviet government, whatever. And then they talk about the Trump Tower Moscow that they were saying he lied about during the campaign. Well, the fact of the matter is that you are allowed to buy property in Russia if you're a U.S. citizen. You are allowed to build in Russia. The sanctions that were slapped on Russia by Barack Obama were more centralized on certain people within the Russian government, certain individuals. The issue with sanctions, and I'm not a supporter of sanctions, but typically sanctions start with targeting a few individuals, their financial assets abroad and their ability to, use those in furthering their own personal business around the world. That's really the way that economic sanctions typically start. Now eventually they do get up to things like banning commerce with an entire country. Those things do happen, but I don't believe under Barack Obama that it reached that level. So, and even if it did, I think it was really towards the end that Barack Obama started levying more difficult sanctions against Russia that would interfere with its actual ability to do business overseas. Then you have the other issue that you see here. So they're protesting against him redacting segments of the investigation and the report that would compromise sources and methods. Well, this is exactly the reason that the Democrats and even the British government were objecting last year to Devin Nunes releasing his memo, the memo of the House Select Committee on Intelligence, that many Democrats said, well, this is harming the intelligence community. It's burning sources and methods. So it says here the UK's intel community fears President Trump could effectively reveal British spying methods if he goes ahead with the publication of a controversial classified Republican memo about alleged wrongdoing by the FBI. Trump has signaled he will not block the memo's release, which he apparently hopes will undermine special counsel Robert Mueller's Russia investigation. Congressional sources told The Telegraph that the UK's spy agencies would be, quote, rankled and less likely to share information with the US should the memo be published. The so-called Nunes memo is believed to focus on FISA warrants that were partially based on intelligence gathered by Christopher Steele, a former British MI6 agent who compiled a dossier containing salacious claims about Trump. Now, what's also interesting is that, according to certain reporting from I think his name is Jeff Solomon from The Hill. So John Solomon. So apparently there are indications that Christopher Steele was himself fired by the FBI only on the surface. He was fired like before the election in 2016. Then apparently he was contacted again, so the FBI fired him on paper, even though they intended to keep him as a source. That would probably make any materials that he provided as part of his investigation very difficult to use in a court of law. So there are issues that you see here where the Democrats don't really have a standard to live by, because they seem to be obsessed more about the fact that there could be some sort of charge or something that Trump hid, or things that he could have done in conjunction with what they were claiming the entire time, Russian collusion, that could be indictable using something like an obstruction of justice charge, or a tax violation, or some sort of campaign finance violation. Ultimately, the bottom line is that these progressive groups, they're going to show up, and 9 times out of 10, these people will be carrying signs that continue to allege that Donald Trump was a Russian agent, while the Mueller report has invalidated that theory. Okay, so these people, in their minds, they still think he's a Russian agent, but there's no way to prove it. So they're not doing a march to indict Donald Trump on obstruction of justice. They're not doing a march to indict Donald Trump on tax evasion. They're not doing a march to indict Donald Trump on, hush money payments to a mistress, which is not really necessarily a crime. But that's really what they are protesting for. They're protesting for things that they themselves are not really using as the real impetus of it. They're starting it with a lie, the Russian collusion myth, and then they're branching it out and saying, well, if we can't get him on collusion, why can't we get him on any of these other charges? I'm sorry, but when you create a movement that's centered around a lie, you don't get to then demand that other truths be revealed out of it that fit your own agenda. That's not the real basis of a search for justice. A search for justice is to know that there's a crime that's out there, a crime that victimized somebody, whether it's, for example, God forbid if a doctor poisons a patient or something, a patient falls ill due to medical malpractice, something like that. There's an underlying crime there, perhaps. Okay, you have to demonstrate that the doctor had malice of intent, or that they engaged in neglect or something. That's the real idea behind looking for justice in the court system. This is not seeking justice. This isn't a journey in favor of reinstating the rule of law. It's really about pursuing an individual because of his political beliefs and policies. And the way to do that is to offer an alternative, campaign against him, and convince the public that you're right. And that's not what they're doing, because they know they can't do it. Because if they did, it would probably be revealed that they themselves have a lot of compromising issues that would probably um, a lot of these politicians that are going after Donald Trump. You look at Bernie Sanders. He has a history of traveling to Russia for political purposes. You have people like Elizabeth Warren, who's made a career out of mischaracterizing and portraying her heritage as something different from what it was, and also for living a white collar lifestyle while claiming to look after the needs of blue collar Americans. You have people like Kamala Harris, who has recently tried to look out as, portray herself as being a stand-up person for minorities and for the black community and for immigrants and everything. What was she when she was Attorney General of California? She was the chief incarcerator. She put, thousands and thousands of people behind bars. Many of them were minority communities or whatever. The only three candidates that, in my opinion, actually provide an alternative vision. Not saying I support it, but I respect them at least. Andrew Yang, Tulsi Gabbard, and Mike Gravel. Those people at least are trying to present themselves as an alternative to Trump, not just anti-Trump. So that's about it. Please like, share, subscribe. Also subscribe to me on BitChute at Chef Leopard. You can find me on Gab at Starscream85. You can also find me on Minds at Chef Leopard, as well as on Twitter, and all the other links I should put in the comments, and you'll be able to see it today. Have a great Wednesday. It's hump day, guys. Bye-bye.